on the website?
This meeting is being recorded.
Yes, yes. Zoom tells us several different times it's being recorded. It's fine. Thank you. First of all, I am honored to be here to speak. Anytime I have the opportunity to speak during either the celebration of Dr. King or during Black History Month, I am grateful for the opportunity to spend time talking with people about subjects that are so close to my heart. As many of us who work in the academy know, that when you're able to teach your passion, it's not work. And every day is a process of discovery. And even as I put together these few words today, I discovered so much that I didn't know. And I will also say, I actually put together PowerPoint too, but I can't figure out how to show the PowerPoint and my speech at the same time. So I will get better with this PowerPoint business. So at several points, I may ask you to imagine with me. So I think that many of us are of an age that we will remember some of the pictures to which I am referring. To begin, I've entitled this speech, "The Dream," a title or a diversion. And let me begin with this question. Why is it anytime and every time we celebrate Dr. King, we hear the same words, "I have a dream"? Is it because talking about dreams won't really bother anyone? Or is it because we just want to believe that hearing those immortal words will move the soul of the nation and the dream will become reality? Mm-hmm. This question then leads me to one more question. As Dr. King wrestled with what he wanted to say to the thousands of marchers who gathered in Washington, D.C. on that hot summer day in August of 1963, to draw the nation's attention to the legal discrimination, restrictive policies, and soul-crushing poverty impacting Black and poor folk across the country, what was the message he meant to leave with them? Did Dr. King, a man who by this point had spent more than a decade leading marches, going to jail, negotiating and pleading on speakers' platforms across the country and the world for the liberation of his people, only want the nation to think about a dream? What we're here to celebrate is more than an extraordinary man and his dream. What we celebrate, and this is important, listen to this, what we celebrate is the idea that as a nation, the promise of the United States is real. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness knows no race, no gender, sexual orientation, or socioeconomic status. What we celebrate, that as Americans, we can work to be better people who can transcend the flaws of our past and create a better future for us all. And it is in that context that we celebrate the man who made us believe that dream again. I would like to take a closer look at the title of this speech, title of the speech. Technically, there was no title. In doing my research for this speech, I actually discovered the old program. And in the program, Dr. King is listed as giving remarks. Perhaps the part of the speech most stirring and easy to remember is the portion about the dream. But on close analysis of the speech, is that the best title? Let's start with a few facts. Right from the beginning, we know that there are 1,662 words in that speech. What Mayor forgot to tell you is that I teach speech. I teach communication. So in the section of the speech that frequently gets played during every Martin Luther King Day celebration, there are 262 words. Let me repeat. The dream portion of the speech is 262 words. Now, for those of you who study math back in college or quick this way, know that you can figure out that that's only about 16, 17% of the speech. was about the dream. So what was the other 83, 84% about? To best understand that portion of the speech, we need to know a bit of context. In April of 1963, the SCLC, who remembers, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, launched a human rights campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, to draw attention to the city's system of racial segregation. The campaign did not begin well. There was hostility from the white community and indifference and fatigue in the Black community. Dr. King was arrested on April 12th and placed in solitary confinement. Consequently, in May, Dr. King reluctantly agreed to the children's campaign. Now, what that was is children in Birmingham stopped out of school, marched, were arrested, and completely filled the jails of the city. The Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, was particularly hostile to the demonstrators and decided to use high-powered fire hoses to disband the marchers. Those horrifying and violent images broadcast around the country increased calls for action. And I bet you right now, many of us can imagine those pictures in our mind. President John Kennedy, in response to the negative media, proposed a civil rights bill on June 11th, 1963. Though agreements were tentatively reached in the city of Birmingham, tensions remained high. And as a side note, I would say a little less than a month after the March on Washington, a bomb was placed at the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 little Black girls getting ready to go to Sunday school. The summer of 1963 was a time of racial unrest, and because of increased media focus and attention, a time for generating new awarenesses and alliances. Organizers of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom wanted to make more transparent the connection between economic issues and racial justice. A. Philip Randolph from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and president of the Negro American Labor Council called Dr. King in March of 1963 and said his organization was planning a march to promote Black job rights. By May, there was growing support for the march from many of the civil rights organizations, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress of Racial Equality, called CORE, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Civil rights leaders notified the White House that the march would take place on August 28, 1963. And as they did, the goals of the march became clear. The marchers were said to want, number one, a comprehensive civil rights bill that would do away with segregated public accommodations. I'll pause just here for a second and say, in the summer of 1961, my family and I took a ride from Cleveland to California. Now, I don't think I'm ancient, but I remember the signs that said, no Black folk. I also remember, right, as a child, my mother had made reservations, and the woman just very kindly said, oh, y'all are not from around here. You can't sleep here. So that's a part of my history. So it's real. And a lot of times when I say this in classes, students don't believe that this was true in a lifetime in person that they know, but it was. Number two, protection for the right to vote. Sound familiar? 3, mechanisms for seeking redress of the violations of constitutional rights. 4, desegregation of all public schools in 1963. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. 5, a massive federal works program to train and place unemployed workers. And number 6, a federal Fair Employment Practices Act, barring discrimination in all employment. As word of the speech spread, more organizations joined in to support the effort. And they included the NAACP, the National Urban League, the National Catholic Conference for Interracial Justice, the National Council of Churches of Christ in America, the United Auto Workers, and many more. In short, the March on Washington was a march for justice and access to an economic stability that would afford all Black folk secure and comfortable lives. With the context established, let's now turn our attention to the speech itself. Dr. King knew he was on a long list of speakers and he would not have much time to make his remarks. He also knew that the purpose of the march was to focus on jobs and economic disparity. Now, as I've already confessed, as a longtime speech teacher, the most common advice we give speakers is to, first of all, figure out what point it is you want to make, and then fit it to the audience you are addressing. Now, for Dr. King, the purpose was clear. Audience was complicated. While Dr. King had the 250,000 people immediately in front of him, he knew he also had millions more at home viewing on television. The question then becomes for the speakers, what can I achieve here? What will satisfy my immediate audience and what will motivate the television audience? Now, in a persuasive speech, the speaker typically tries to accomplish 5 tasks. Number 1, attract attention to the topic at hand. Number 2, illustrate to the audience what the problem is and why it affects them. Number 3, illustrate how that need might be resolved. Number 4, visualize with the audience what the solution to the problem would look like. That was 4. And number 5, leave the audience with concrete action steps to move toward resolving the problem. So, taking advantage of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, King reminds the audience of what a government can do to right the wrongs of history and suggests it is the belief in those positive actions that brought the marchers to the nation's capital. With the audience's attention captured, King then turned to the purpose of his speech with these words. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. For those of you who are following along with the speech or know the speech, know that passage is much longer. In it, Dr. King lays out clearly the problems of Black people in America in the early 1960s. It is important to note that he is not simply talking about bad attitudes or hateful language. He talks about, go back to the speech, he says, manacles of segregation and chains of discrimination. In other words, he's saying that there are laws and structures that need to be changed. And that's why the marchers have come to the nation's capital, the seat of government where that kind of change can take place. Here he continues. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, Black men and white men, should have included women, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. In this key passage of the speech, Dr. King introduces the metaphor of a check. And not just any check, but a bad check. And if you recall, the purpose of the march was to connect economic justice with racial justice and civil rights. Here's where Dr. King tries to address the purpose of the march in a way that will address both his immediate audience and his television audience. His immediate audience will resonate with the notion that a bank of justice is not bankrupt. His television audience, which we know from research, is skewed more northern, white, and liberal, would resonate with the notion of the check. This is a clear signal to the TV audience that the work of civil rights was shifting from just the courts to the economic structures of society. Here, Dr. King, as he says, but we refuse to believe the bank of justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check. A check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Think about the power of those words. The strength of the civil rights movement was always its reliance on the words of the Constitution itself. Speech after speech, given not only by Dr. King, but all the great orators of the civil rights movement, from John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ralph Abernathy, Bayard Rustin, Kwame Ture, Ella Baker, talked about the legal and moral grounds on which Black folks were demanding their rights. Those speeches said that as citizens, we have a right to life. We have a right to liberty. We have a right to pursue happiness. That as Black folks, we have a right to live free from harassment, from terror, from vigilante groups, whether in the North or the South. The takeaway here is simple. The speech to those gathered for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was not so much about a dream as it was about demanding that the promises made in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution be kept. And not just in terms of white people being nicer to Black people, but in terms of changing the laws, eliminating the barriers, and reforming the policies that kept Black folk from accessing the kind of financial stability that would afford them more balanced and secure lives. That is why I don't call this speech the dream speech. I call it the bad check speech. Dr. King was putting America on notice that the civil rights movement recognized the importance of economic stability and intended to work toward achieving those goals. A note about the dream. What many people don't know is that those 262 words were not included in the original manuscript Dr. King brought with him to the speaker's podium that day. So the question is, where did the words come from? What we know is that Dr. King had previously given a speech in Detroit, Michigan at Cobo Hall, where he talked about the dream in very much the words he used in the March on Washington. We also know that Dr. King was influenced by the previous speakers that day who remained and surrounded him as he spoke. One of those speakers was the famed gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, who at one point in the speech, after Dr. King had laid out his economic argument, called from behind, "Tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream." This is where Dr. King's experience as a preacher took over. He had delivered the economic speech, and now he was ready to preach the audience toward action. Though I wanted to clarify the title of the speech, please understand, those words are important words for us to remember and to motivate us as we do our justice work in the 21st century. In reviewing the goals of the march, there was a demand for educational equity. Why? It was not lost on the marchers that there cannot be financial solvency for a community without access to decent education. Brown v. Board happened 9 years earlier. However, the clause in that decision that change would be made with all deliberate speed had left many school districts stalled by administrative indecision, blatant obfuscation of court's intentions, as well as stubborn intransigency inhibiting any desegregation action. Rather than focusing on school issues from 60 years ago, let's take a look at what I consider to be a chief civil rights issue today, educational equity. In the 1960s, the focus of educational reformers in the Black community was on segregation and discrimination. Now we talk about equity, providing each student what they need to succeed the way that works best for them. Some students start school knowing how to read, while other students don't understand the language of instruction. When we talk about equity in 2023, we go beyond equality and move toward equitable solutions that will meet students where they are and then take them where they need to go. If Dr. King were alive today, what would he see? He would probably focus on poverty and homelessness. According to the US Census Bureau's report, official poverty measure, the official poverty rate in 2021 was 11.6% with 37.9 million people in poverty. What I find interesting are the rates of poverty by racial groups. So, for example, Blacks are about 13.4% of the population, but 22.6% of those in poverty. Hispanic and Latinos are about 19% of the poverty, about 19% of the whole population, but 28.2% of those in poverty. Native Americans, 1.3% of the overall population, but 2.6% of those in poverty. Dr. King would see food insecurity. Approximately 1 in 5 adults reported experiencing household food insecurity. Food insecurity is important. Food insecurity can damage children's health and brain development for years before they enter a classroom. By kindergarten, food insecure children are often cognitively, emotionally, and physically behind their food secure peers. Dr. King would see mental health concerns. According to the Journal of American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, 1 in 5 Americans, 1 in 5, will have a diagnosable mental health disorder before they turn 18. Dr. King would see Black students are more likely to be arrested at school or suspended or misunderstood just because of their race. A Yale study in 2016 showed that teachers expected Black children, boys in particular, to misbehave. Data from the US Department of Education indicates that nearly half of preschoolers who were suspended were Black. And what makes that stunning is that only 19% of all preschoolers are Black. Dr. King would see also that white school districts receive more funding on average than non-white districts. In 2019, a report from the nonprofit organization EdBuild began with a striking number, $23 billion. That's how much funding predominantly white school districts receive compared, how much more funding white school districts receive compared with districts that serve mostly students of color. Taken together, these sad facts must lead us toward new dreams. As I move to the conclusion of this presentation, I say to you that there is still time to dream. We must dream of a time when the younger generation takes our place as leaders in government, business, and social services and finds a way to meaningfully address the triple plagues of hunger, homelessness, and poverty with creative and new effective system-changing methods. We must find a time when, as educators from kindergarten through college, we recognize that our students cannot learn if they are not healthy. This includes both their physical and mental health, and that part of getting a good education in this country means giving our students access to the right professionals and resources they need. We must dream of a time when children, regardless of race, sex, gender, socioeconomic status, can be seen by their teachers as deserving of care and respect and not feared even when they do something wrong, thus ending the horrifying and brutal record of suspensions and arrests of Black, Latin, and students with disability. We must dream of a time when all children, regardless of zip code, receive the very best education and educational assets available, thus allowing all Americans the chance to meaningfully share in the rich opportunities this nation has to offer. What makes Dr. King so special to us today is that he had the audacity to demand that as a nation, we do better. Not only in changing laws, eliminating discriminatory practices, or writing good policy, but in asking us to love one another. What finally makes sense to me after all these years of studying Dr. King is that none of the changes he proposed then or we talk about now will happen if we don't begin by caring for each other. Beginning in care means seeing the problems around us and then doing what is possible. My final words to you today is to dream the impossible and care enough to make it possible. Thank you so much.
Wow, Terry. I think you found your second TED Talk.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Yes, Sherry.
Well, please, let's talk.
Yeah, questions for Dr. Nance?
May I begin with a question?
Please.
Did anybody here go to the March on Washington, or as a child, or have a parent go to the March on Washington?
My best friend did. I was 16 at the time, and my mother thought it was too frightening for me to go into a large crowd like that. But my best friend did, marched in Washington with Dr. King, and it was really amazing. So yes.
Yeah.
I was part of the TV audience.
Yeah, I never left the TV set. She wouldn't let me out of the house, but I could watch it on TV.
Me too. My dad was there.
on TV too.
Yeah.
When you said the auto, I already thought of your dad.
Yeah, because Walter Reuther had parted ways with the AFL-CIO, and because the AFL did not support the march, but the United Auto Workers did. So,
Wow, I did not know that.
little piece of trivia.
There was a lot in that speech that I didn't know, and I thought I knew it.
Well, I mean, we never get past the dream.
Right, right.
Remember, 262 words.
And I used the dream speech, as you would call it, in my classroom.
That
and
check
so-
speech.
that check speech. I wish I would have had that term at that time last year, but I taught it in a social impact class. And until that point, most of the students had not read that speech. And it lends itself to so much. Anaphora, a great use of anaphora, the metaphors, and how critical, and just how he spoke, and like you said, he went from describing to preaching and just was able to segue into that so beautifully. What a great analysis, Terry. You've just really.
And what I wanted to move away from is that so many of us think of racism as bad behavior by individuals. And if somehow we could just make people be nice to one another, then everything would be fine. And that wasn't true in 1963, and it's certainly not true in 2023.
Mm.
And so we really need to understand that they were talking about economic equality, and they were very acutely aware that you're not going to be able to free people if you don't give them a job, if you don't give them an opportunity to work. Right?
Very true.
And I thought it was also interesting that they were in many ways calling out the hypocrisy of Brown v. Board, when one of the goals of the march was end segregation in schools in 1963. Right? So, it was that whole phrase, which I will say, it took me until, I remember through high school and college, I kept thinking, oh, well, the schools are desegregated. I can't figure out what's going wrong. And yet there was never the motivation to do that in a timely fashion because of the in all delivered speech. And if you think about what that did, is it really allowed many, I'd say not only southern states, mid-Atlantic states, to really create separate school systems that exist to this day. As an aside, I just found this interesting. I had a young man from Georgia in my class. He was a football player who we were talking about. I don't know if a while back there was a thing about that they still had black proms and white prom. Well, they had a black prom and a white prom. Remember that?
Mhm.
And he looked and he said, "Of course." And you see and I use that as an example of why racism persists. Because to him, of course, you have a black prom and a white prom. Like, that's just the way things are. And so when we talk about interrupting, what anti-racism is about is interrupting systems and patterns, is that we have to be able to say to folks, no, that's not the way it should be. I think, wasn't it Morgan Freeman who ultimately gave money so they could have a joint prom together? So and that was, I would say it was less than 10 years ago. So it's just, there's so much work. I mean, we're talking about this 60 years ago, and there's so much work that needs to be done.
Do you have any advice for us as the league, like what we could do?
Well, you're already doing it. What was the second thing? Third, no, wait. It was either third or fourth. Voting. We have, and now we may not have people, well, yeah, we do. I was going to say, we may not have people trying to take away our rights to vote. Oh, yes, we do. Oh, yes, we do. And just because, I am in a social class or a demographic that can read the fine print and I can make sure that I get my ballot, or that I can, go to my polling place and argue my way in, doesn't mean everybody else can. And I think the work that you do is so important, and that focusing on making sure people do things, not only can vote, but have something to vote for, right?
Mhm.
That's what gets people to the polls. And so, Mayor, that's what I think, that's the work you're doing is the work that needs to be continued. And it's at the grassroots level.
That's good to hear. It's good motivation for us. It's good inspiration.
Mhm.
If you think about it, Dr. King was a grassroots kind of guy.
So was Barack Obama. Yeah.
Absolutely. Barack Obama, think about, I'm sorry, Martin King, when we want to talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, had just gotten back from Boston University, right? He was a young
Sorry,
man.
can you repeat that? You just went out for a second.
I'm sorry, that Dr. King was a young man in Montgomery, right? New preacher in Montgomery when the Montgomery bus boycott took place. Now, I did write an article about that. Bus boycott would not have been successful if it weren't for the women who had organized around the preachers, right? And then, because of the nature of speaking, said, oh, we need a preacher to speak, not us, right? Gave him his movement. So, I mean, I'm not faulting anybody. I'm just saying we need to understand that if it weren't for the, and again, it's the work that you do. Who ran off the flyers to tell everybody not to take the bus? Who was it who organized, who did the groundwork for setting up the system of getting people to where they needed to go using different people's cars? Who was it who set up the exchange of food so people knew, how they were going to cook their dinner? That was all done by women. The article I wrote was the missing voice, but my field is rhetoric, and one of the things I argue is that there's all kinds of rhetoric, and for a long time women did not have equal access to the podium, but that did not mean that they were, if you think of rhetoric as this symbolic creation of culture, that didn't mean that women were not intimately and actively involved in that process. They did it through, boy, I'm going off on a tangent, but I mean, during the civil rights period, it was done through educating the young people from around the country who came with the Freedom Riders, right? It was Black women, right, who took them in, told them how they needed to behave, fed them, nursed their bruises, that when we think about all the big marches and all that sort of thing, that or a lot of that core organizational work was done by women. And so never underestimate the power of the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Do you have any suggestions for us about things that we ought to be reading other than the article you wrote that you just mentioned? It's really interesting, and I'm going to go look it up.
No, it's Devin's too old. Let me see. I'm going to turn around just for a second, because I actually stacked up they were on my desk, but I stacked them up behind me. What am I reading these days? Oh yeah. Well, I'm in higher education, so Freeman Habrowski's book about the empowered university is really important. I don't know if any of you are educators, but one of the things that Freeman Habrowski does is he essentially, he was at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And if you think about where he was drawing his kids from, his students, right? He's drawing them from Washington, D.C. He's drawing them from Baltimore. He's drawing them from rural areas. These are not kids who were expected to succeed. And yet that college has the record of sending more Black and brown kids to medical school, to research institutions than anybody else. Why? Because he believed those kids could learn. And he said, what we need to do is change the way we teach them. Now, as college educators, you go, oh my gosh, you mean there's a different way I could organize my course? I've been teaching it this way for so long. It's worked so well. Well, it's not working now. And to do that in the sciences. So I love that book. My Grandmother's Hands is another book. If you haven't read that, I love that one. Let's see. I don't know if any of you are at Catholic institutions, but we just had Brian Massingale, who was a Jesuit priest, a gay graduate. So an out gay Jesuit priest come to our campus, and his presentation was just stunning. And his book is Racial Justice in the, go figure that one out. Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, which is phenomenal. So that's what I'm also reading. I also am rereading Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, along with How to Be an Anti-Racist, because I just use that material so much. And I think that's probably, Deb, one of the big things that I say is that I'm using the term anti-racism a lot more, because as a differentiator, because too many people are happy to stop at diversity. Oh, we've got some brown ones, we've got some Black ones, and aren't we happy? And I would say from years of doing my work, it's just not enough. You can't stop at diversity. And I'm even going so far as to say, you can't even stop, at, even what we say is inclusion, because I can hope to make you included, but if I have not figured out how to give you what you need in order to succeed, and that's equity, then the inclusion will not be authentic, and I'm not going to be able to move forward. So that when really we're talking about the work of equity and inclusion, that to me is anti-racism work. And anti-racism, according to Kendi, is anything, right, that disrupts racism. And racism, right, is that, you know, when racist ideas and racist policies produce unequal results. So that's why I threw in those numbers. It's not an accident that, you know, 13.4% of the population, of the Black population, you know, that Black folk are 13.4% of the overall population, and with 22% of those who are poor. And the other stunning number from the Yale study, you know, that more than half of the kids who get thrown out of preschool, right, are Black, when only 19% of all kids in preschool are Black. You know, clearly, this is one of the things that the reason why I go toward anti-racism is that we have to believe, and Stephen Covey said this, that if you put good people in a bad system, you're going to get bad results. So what I'm saying is that good people do racist things. Not because they intentionally, not because they mean to, not because they want to, but because that's the way that things, because we're following the rules, right? We're doing what we're supposed to do. You know, the book said to do this. Well, if it produces, if it doesn't provide an equitable opportunity to folks, then it becomes racist. And we have to become clear what the term is about in order to begin to work to remedy some of the situations we are. Darlene.
What you were saying just led me to think about redlining. And it seems as if there really should be some way of doing some reparations for the people whose homes were taken, well, who were made valueless, or lesser value than the people who left and went to the suburbs.
Darlene, first of all, I'm going to make sure that we're all on the same page as I respond to you. Do we all understand redlining? That this was a practice, and as much as I want to say this was a practice long ago, it's still happening. But and what it was businessmen making perfectly sound business decisions, right? Perfectly sound business decisions, saying these areas are Black. Who's going to want to run? Who will want to move in there? Therefore, those houses cannot be worth that much money. And literally, there were areas that had red lines around them. And those were the designated minoritized areas that no one would want to go into. Let me give you an actual example. My dad, the UAW person, one of the things you have to know is that, my father passed away a couple of years ago, but I still talk about him as though he were alive. But he was, like many of our fathers, he worked 2 or 3 jobs. But one of the jobs my father worked is he became a real estate agent. He actually studied and took the real estate exam and became a real estate agent. Why? Because one of the things he and my mother figured out is that as they began to, we were a family of 6, so there were 8 of us all together. As we wanted to leave our inner city Cleveland home and move to the suburbs, they couldn't find houses to be shown to them. So my father gets a real estate agent, gets a real estate license so he can get the listings. And we actually moved into an area of Ohio called Shaker Heights, Ohio, which was a part of the great experiment. Except what was the secret was that there was a designated interracial section of Shaker Heights, and then there was the white section. And of course, my father buys a house in the white section. And so that's another whole story. But what becomes interesting, and I'm telling you, the internet is fantastic these days. I went back and I looked up our house on 135th Street in which was now in one of those very redlined areas. Now, if you think about it, most middle-class people, the biggest investment is your home, right? So I think about our house in Shaker Heights. I remember my parents may have paid the whopping sum of $60,000 for the house, and when we sold it, I don't know, 10 years ago, it was a couple $100,000, right? The house my parents sold on 135th Street off Kinsman for maybe $20,000 today is worth $23,000. And here's the point I would want to make, is that does not happen by accident. And this is also where I would add on that people would say, but it's reasonable. It's not a good area, right? But what we need to look at are the justice issues involved in there, right? And there's another little story. You probably hear it. Whenever you want me to shut up, just put up your hand and I will, and then I'll stop talking. When my father went to buy the house, remember it was in an all white area, right? And they were putting down more than half of the purchase price of the home, right? They were buying a home, putting down more than half the purchase price. My parents could not get a bank to lend them the money.
Oh,
And this is generally where I tell the story. My father called up his fraternity brother to help him and said, oh, God, I don't know what to do. And the fraternity brother said, well, we're going to have to go to court. My father's fraternity brother was Louis Stokes.
wow.
And what's interesting is that I don't know whether it was because of Lou Stokes or not, but the bank that took the risk of giving my father the loan is still the bank that my brothers and sisters use in Cleveland today. Yeah, and that's also a part of the business deal. Take a risk on people and they will be loyal. So, and so I guess that's the other part of saying that happened 50, 60 years ago. And yet when you look at that house on 135th Street now, and the family that bought it, what can you say? What can you say? Except that is what Dr. King, what Bayard Rustin, by the way, A. Philip Randolph is often credited as the person who organized the March on Washington, but let me just say, A. Philip Randolph was the spokesperson. Bayard Rustin was the one who put it together. But again, because people are complicated, life is complicated, the Baptist ministers were not excited about having a very out gay Quaker as their, sort of spokesperson. But all this trivia that you're getting, drop it in conversations along the way.
Yes. Does anybody else have any questions for Dr. Nance? No. I guess I want to know, what you think the future for DEI is.
I will answer this in 2 minutes because I do have to feed my husband.
Okay.
I would say that the future of DEI is strong
Oh, good.
because it has to be. What is happening in Florida is an abomination. And it will, Dr. King has, the only way that evil will continue or persist is when good people don't fight against it. There has got to be a fight that is mounted against the kind of really atrocities, the intellectual atrocities that are happening in Florida. Free speech. I can't believe that someone who is purportedly so, connected to our basic constitutional rights is trampling all over people's right to learn. But here's the point. What I believe is stronger, Mayor, is I believe that there is a passion, especially in our younger students today, for justice. And they will not sit still. They will not. Say what you will about Gen Z. Granted, they are crazy, they're a little neurotic, but they have a real passion for justice.
I do.
Yes,
And
that's great.
and they're creative and they're smart. And what's different than the Gen Zers, than millennials, is the Gen Zers will tell you to your face and then say, let's work it out. So
That gives me hope.
no, and I think what it really is about is that, especially as we're on the far side, is I think intergenerational communication has got to happen, because I think that those of us who are older and those of us, again, we got to get together. And I find that when I can get to talk to students who are, justice oriented, they can't get enough. They cannot get enough of the stories and the strategies. So that's where the hope lies.
Well, Dr. Nance, you never cease to amaze me. This was wonderful. Thank you so much. We're so grateful that you were here for our Black History Month. Oh, thank you.
It was truly a pleasure and an honor. I love chatting with you. Please invite me back sometime.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Yes.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
You too, Terry. Thank you for coming.
Take care, all.
Bye-bye.
If I could ask the program committee to stay a little bit, I know you're going to want to watch the State of the Union. So I just wanted to, Darlene's here, so I just wanted her to give us an update on the February and April meetings. Darlene, can you do that, please?
Well,
Is Anton still set for February from the Prison Society?
Right?
Say that again.
This tonight was the February meeting?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. No, I do have a speaker, well, two together for the April meeting, April 11th. And I sent you, I think I sent it to, I may not have included you, Iris. I'll get that out to you. But I had just sent out, oh dear, let me just.
Yeah, I know we were trying to get, like, for Women's History Month, we were trying to get a female.
That's the thing.
Right.
I have
That
two
didn't work out.
females who have written a report for the Dauphin County Bail Fund. This is a history teacher at Dickinson, and
Oh, wow.
and she had an intern working for Dauphin County Bail Fund, making a report about the first 6 months of 2022, which, well, they'll be able to tell you about it, but shows, for one thing, most of the people who are unable to pay bail are Black people. And anyway, and that there are disparities among the district justices in terms of how bail is assessed. And they'll be able to explain that people are not supposed to be given bail higher than they have any ability to pay, but that very often does not happen. So that's part, that's the package for April. Now, I was not able to reach Anton
From the Prison
quick.
Society, right?
Yes. It seems like a bit of a miscommunication as to, what we wanted. But frankly, I haven't been able to get a call back from him, and I can still try, because I wasn't sure whether you were looking for somebody for the annual meeting or this meeting, but somebody from the Prison Society would be a good person. Now, the head of I guess the director of the Prison Society in Pennsylvania is a woman, Claire Schubik Richards, I think. I have not tried to get her. I was thinking she'd make a wonderful speaker for either our annual meeting or the Pennsylvania League of Women Voters meeting. But can give me some direction.
Yeah, Shari, would you like her for the annual meeting, our annual meeting?
If I can see her bio, but it sounds like she might be well versed, and that would be a good topic. It might draw in more people, because it's constantly in the news right now. We don't need to,